there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation or myths that are still out there. And I think the only way to do it is more podcasts like this and trying to get information out there that we're not just making this stuff up. We spend a lot of money in clinical trials and it's all done by good practice clinical guidelines, and we follow a lot of things, and we're not seeing any adverse effects, you know.
Scott?
Yeah, it's crazy. I think there's just so many myths and misconceptions about creatine, but we know that creatine, at least in animal models, can be protective against traumatic brain injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few studies in children and adolescents that have shown enhanced recovery following a concussion. So it's kind of ironic, you know, that you'll put your kid in a sport where they can get a concussion, or there's a high likelihood of getting a concussion, and they think that taking creatine is the unsafe thing to do, when it's actually, you know, maybe playing football or hockey is actually way more unsafe than taking creatine is. But yeah, there's lots of evidence to show that creatine is not only effective in those populations, but also could be protective as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fascinating to me that many, and I've run into the same thing, whey protein with creatine as an example, and parents being highly hesitant. And to your point, Scott, but right after football practice, they'll take them to 7-Eleven for Pop-Tarts and a Slurpee, and they're worried about creatine and whey protein. So it becomes fascinating. Two of the best substances you can put in the human body, you know, and with the utmost benefit. And as Darren had said too, highly cost effective.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of the two populations, I want to address, and you basically address the issue with kids that, I mean, they're already consuming protein, which has creatine, and creatine's already in your body. And then Scott alluded to some of the TBI data, traumatic brain injury data, in infants and young kids. And even there's a study in teenage fin swimmers showing that creatine supplementation helps performance. So that, the issue of under 18, I think there's not as much data there, but it makes sense to me that you can supplement with it, because to me, it's, as Darren alluded, it's sort of like if you look at the evolution of protein, this is sort of following that same track. So the question is, and that was sort of a long preamble, the question is, now let's look at sex differences, if they exist. Sex differences and age differences. So let's first deal with sex. Is there a male-female difference? Take it away, gentlemen.
Yeah, so we've measured this repeatedly, and Mark Turner-Polsky was one of the first to look at this. So the thought was that there was a sex difference because there was some evidence to suggest, in general, if the female has smaller skeletal muscle compared to the anatomy of the male, they're going to have a higher concentration or higher resting initial creatine levels. And as Scott's already mentioned, that's probably the number one thing that dictates your responsiveness. So that's why vegans seem to respond extremely well, where someone on a carnivore diet may not. But when you look at the totality of the evidence, males and females respond very well, if not the exact same, from a muscle growth or performance perspective. We see phenomenal benefits in females from a bone health perspective. And since it's emerging in the brain, the majority of those individual children that had concussion were female. So to me, I always say that no, it makes no sense. Same response to protein. The only thing we've ever come across is from an anti-catabolic effect. So Johnny Parisi is at McMaster University, and when he measured leucine oxidation, or a direct indicator of whole body breakdown, it was only young males who had a reduction. And we've measured a few times this amino acid compound called 3-methylhistidine, is another crude indicator of whole body breakdown, and it was only reduced in males. So there was a few lines of evidence to suggest that males may have more anti-catabolic effects from creatine. And then I talked to Abby Smith-Ryan about this, and it might have to do with estrogen. Now, we don't know. We're speculating that was only the difference. But at the end of the day, I say there's a couple lines of evidence to suggest that males might have a more preservating environment for muscle recovery, but both males or females respond extremely well. So again, there's no reason I'm seeing that it's one sex or the other.
Scott, elaborate on that, as well as if there's age differences. If you're a young, strapping, college male versus old dudes like Tony.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go back and highlight one study that was done by Abby Smith-Ryan as well. So I know Darren mentioned her. She's probably the best kind of creatine researcher in a female population. And she actually recently looked at the influence of creatine across the menstrual cycle. And interestingly, she showed actually no difference in body mass changes between creatine supplementation and placebo, either in the luteal phase or the follicular phase. But she did show it in the luteal phase that you tended to put on more water, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, and then I started thinking as well, I'm like, okay, if you're putting on water and not putting on mass, how does that actually work? But if you look at the data itself, it looks like they're trending in the same direction. So it does look like if you are a female taking creatine, you at least retain a little bit more water during the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase. So we need to watch more of Abby Smith-Ryan's research that's going to come out relatively soon. Again, looking at creatine supplementation in the female population. So there might be some differences, at least across the menstrual cycle. And then your question was looking at the effects of creatine in younger adults versus older adults. And that's an interesting question as well. And we know that it's actually effective in both those populations. So we've done a systematic review looking at over 35 individual studies were included. That included both younger populations and older populations. And we showed from a lean tissue mass perspective that they were similar. So that's, yeah, some positive evidence that creatine could be a benefit for not only younger individuals trying to put on muscle, but also older adults as well.
That's good news for us, Tony.
Yeah, just quick question. Yeah, exactly. And quick question, Darren, Scott, do we know, it would probably make sense because particularly if, if the individual as they age is undergoing sarcopenia, but do we know if endogenous production, there's a significant decline as one ages, assuming even with, dietary factors being equal? Do we know anything much about that or?
Yeah, so there's,
okay, go ahead.
There's a nice review that Darren was a part of, Chillibeck 2017, that looked at how much creatine was in different muscles in the body.
Okay.
And they actually showed no difference between young and old when they included all the muscles. But when they just looked at the vastus lateralis, there was actually less creatine in an older individual compared to a younger individual.
Okay.
So it might be muscle specific,
Mhm.
at least again with the responsiveness to creatine supplementation.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, very
Yeah, the phospho-creatine kinetics in aging is very, there's tons of variability. You'll see a lot of, Paul Greenhalgh would argue there's no differences. And then even in the lower limb, we saw no difference in the gastroc and tibialis anterior, but the muscles that are mainly used for high explosive movements, squat, leg press, sprinting, the vastus lateralis was different. So that's why we think when you look at the overall results, the lower body seems to really improve statistically with creatine supplementation, and that may be because they're impaired. So when you look at all that, and so I argue it's like when people are designing resistance training programs for an older adult, make sure you do way more volume for the lower limbs than the upper limbs because they're compromised. We published a study in 2005 clearly showing that aging negatively affects all muscle groups in the body, but the lower regions were more negatively affected. So therefore, when you're doing 3 sets for your upper body, you're probably wanting to do 5 or 6 sets for the lower body just to offset the negative effects of aging.
Wow, really interesting. And I guess in part that could be specificity regarding activity too,
Yes.
right? People tend to explode less as they age and maybe the demand isn't there for production.
Yeah.
But that's great. Good to know. Really interesting.
And it makes sense as we get older, escalators are used more often, elevators, you don't see a lot of
Perfect,
people
yeah.
sprinting and all that. And we kind of lie to people as they get older, say, oh, you're too old to do that, take your time. And in theory, that's why power training has become so popular and resistance training should be looked at. And I'm very happy to see a lot of older people in the gyms nowadays, way more than it used to be. And the lower limbs are so important for functionality and withstanding falls and fractures and all that. And it just clearly shows if you're having more reduction in one part of the body, and that could be because they're more active in the upper body, you might have to do more volume to offset the negative effects. But what do most people do, especially males? We skip legs. It's
Exactly.
very, very stereotypical, but a lot of times they'll skip legs, right? So
Yep.
especially with our older populations, leg press and squat, if it can be done, leg extension, those things are super important, right? So